Great. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Alawalia. I work for climate change charity Ashden, and welcome to this webinar run by Ashden and Footsteps, which is Faith, Energy and Climate Retrofitting Places of Worship in the UK. Next slide, please, Frida. So as a bit of background, Ashden are a climate change charity, initially founded 25 years ago to run the Ashden Awards, and you can see a photo of one of our ceremonies there. Right now, we work with councils, schools and communities across the UK to share best practice on climate action. And Footsteps are an interfaith organisation based in Birmingham, focusing on the intersections between faith and climate action. And they were set up in response to the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. Next slide, please, Frida. Thank you. Footsteps and Ashden work together as part of the Birmingham Interfaith Climate Action Partnership. This is also in collaboration with the Bahu Trust. So the Hazrat Sultan Bahu Trust is a mosque founded in 1983. The Bahu Trust has an international reputation for leading on religious guidance, educational courses and community projects, and they also have a climate action focus as well. The purpose of the Birmingham Interfaith Climate Action Partnership, which started a year ago and is running for another couple of years, is to build the capacity of faith-inspired groups in Birmingham for climate action. So as part of this project, we'll be giving small grants to faith-inspired groups to deliver climate action projects, doing some support and upskilling of these groups, and also sharing all the knowledge and all the interest and all the excitement and the successes and the challenges that come from these projects and the programme nationally as part of a national webinar series, which will also explore how faith-inspired groups and local authorities can collaborate better when it comes to planning climate action initiatives. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is looking at retrofit of faith-inspired buildings. And we know lots of great work has already happened in this space over the last few decades. And we particularly like to dedicate this webinar to the late Tom Greaves, who has done really exceptional work and sparked great work when it comes to the retrofit of faith buildings, but also countless other people over the years that have done the same. Now, Footsteps have previously ran a program called the 4F project, which worked with groups such as Eco Birmingham, CSC, and the Active Wellbeing Society. And this was all about energy reduction in faith buildings. And what a lot of today's insights will be, and we'll be sharing some of the learnings from the 4F project, and Chris Martin from Footsteps will share more on that later. But why retrofit and why buildings? Well, we know about 22% of the UK carbon emissions comes from buildings. So reducing energy demand whilst making buildings more efficient, we know will cut energy bills, it will improve the health and well-being of our properties, and it will also create economic opportunities in new communities and in new areas for many people in the green economy. Final slide. And we want to know what you may be doing in this area when it comes to energy efficiency or retrofit. We have a QR code on screen, or you can fill out the Menti poll link in the chat if you haven't already, just to tell us a little bit more about what they're doing in this area. And yeah, we've got a really great agenda today. It's going to be quite a busy session. We'll hear from Professor Jeff Levermore from the Tyndall Centre at Manchester University, talking about the faith-based imperative for climate action and retrofit. We'll hear from Chris Walsh, also at the Tyndall Centre, about getting started on retrofit. Chris Martin from Footsteps will share some reflections on some of Chris Walsh's findings within the experience of Footsteps' energy audits that they've taken and supported. And we'll also look at some case studies. So these include Harriet Martin talking about the Cottridge Quaker Meeting House retrofit, and also Phil Beardmore, who's delivered a number of energy audits and retrofits, particularly looking at faith buildings, and he'll share some learnings and insights from the energy audit at the Al Mahdi Institute and the subsequent energy saving program. So Frida, if you'd like to stop sharing your slides, I'm just going to see if I can share the poll results. I've never actually tried to do this live in Teams before through Mentimeter, so this is very much a trial, but hopefully you should see the results come up on your screen in a second. So it's asking me to log in, so I'm going to do my backup and just share my screen and go through the old-fashioned way. So can you see my screen? It should have the poll results there. Loading.
Just having a think. There we go.
Great. So has your chosen place of worship taken measures to improve energy efficiency? 35 say yes. 35 say unsure. 53 say yes, which is great to see, and 12% say no. What barriers does your Faith Inspired group face to getting going on retrofit? Lots of answers here. Finance, funding, money. Funding is the key. What else do we have? Good advice on what is feasible, always important, and a lack of information. One saying it's a large medieval grade one listed building. And finally, has your Faith Inspired group engaged with your local authority on climate action? 4 say yes, 5 say no, 1 unsure. And we're particularly interested in asking that question because as part of our Birmingham Climate Action Faith Programme, we'll be looking at the intersections between faith-inspired communities and councils as well. So you'll hear more about that in the future. But I'm delighted to hand over now to our first speaker, and I think Frida's going to bring up the slides, and that's Professor Jeff Livermore. So Jeff Livermore is an emeritus professor of the built environment at Manchester University and was a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 4th assessment report, which contributes to the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to the IPCC in 2007. Jeff, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. And well, there we are. That's the first slide on Manchester University. If I could have the next slide, please. Right, I'm a Unitarian. I won't go into that too much, but these are some of the Unitarian chapels I know in the Northwest. I go to the top left one, Norcliffe. I also go to the middle upper one, Dean Row, and Dunham Road is in Altrincham, and others there. That they're fairly old buildings and not very easy to retrofit. And so I have also been going to a lot more as I'm president of the Unitarians now, but next slide, please. I'm basically a building services engineer, and I've been working with buildings. And the building you see on the left there is the Elizabeth Fry building at East Anglia, which is one of the best buildings I've come across for comfort, and its energy is quite good too. It uses the thermal mass of the building, and you'll notice it hasn't got large amounts of glazing, because the rest of the campus at East Anglia has got a tremendous amount of glazing, which is a major problem. But I've been very keen on energy saving, climate change for many years, and a great believer in putting wind turbines and solar panels wherever they can be. And I've just quoted down there in the bottom that we need to spend 4.4% of GNP, or 154 billion per year, or 1.23 trillion in total. So it's quite a major problem, but it can be done. It's just a question of money and incentive. And I think that we should see a lot more. Now, we've got a few climate deniers that are in senior positions in governments around the world now. And I'd just like to show a couple of slides that come from the Antarctic, courtesy of the British Antarctic Survey. And the human influence on atmospheric carbon dioxide can be seen because when the snow falls in Antarctica, it only melts slightly, and then the next snowfall in the next winter, and it builds up. And there are a few kilometres of ice down there. Now, you'll see on the left there that if you drill down and get a core of ice and then slice it, there are bubbles in there of air, and you can analyse those bubbles and analyse the atmosphere going back over hundreds of years. And this graph here, by looking at the carbon-13 isotope of carbon dioxide, that is different for fossil fuels as opposed to the normal atmosphere. So fossil fuel CO2 is different from natural CO2 in the atmosphere. So we can detect directly what we, humankind, are putting into the atmosphere. And if you look at the left-hand graph, you'll see that the amount of carbon-13 is actually decreasing because the foliage of the fossil fuels which it originally came from did not take up carbon-13 as much. So it starts to reduce at about 1750, which is when the Industrial Revolution started. And you can see on the right-hand graph there, 1750, and you can see the carbon dioxide going up quite considerably. And I think that is the evidence of what we are doing. And I'm surprised that this isn't shown more and more occasions. It's a very important graph. And I use it in most of the lectures I give. And some people are probably pretty bored with seeing it, but it's very important. Next slide, please. The other thing is the inequality. And this Oxfam slide here, that the richest 10% are responsible for 50% of emissions. And that triangle effectively shows what happens, that the richest part of the world are consuming an incredible amount and emitting 50%. And I think the top 1% of the population are 10% of the consumption. And on the left-hand side there is one of my old students who became the energy minister in Burkina Faso. Anyway, the moral issue, some people say, well, Britain is only doing about 2% of the carbon emissions in the world. It's nothing to do with us. But if we go back to 1750, we'll see that the biggest chunk there is Europe. It's also interesting if you look at where China is, and it's starting off about 1950, it starts to come in, that it was not a very developed country back in 1950. And this is what China has done. And there's India. And so we have put more into the atmosphere than a lot of other countries. And I think that it comes down to what is our carbon emission per person. Next slide, please. And the fact is the Earth gets more solar energy in 1 hour than the entire world uses in a year. Okay, a fair amount of that goes into the weather. But we can see here the big circle is the solar irradiance that the Earth receives. We've got wind there, and this little circle here is the total annual world energy use, and we've got hydro, biomass, waves, tidal, and geothermal. And I think the fact is that with a lot more wind turbines and solar panels, we can make a lot of use of the resources. And the amazing thing is that once these things are built, a lot of people perhaps don't realise it, but the sunshine is free, and so is the wind. And I think when one looks at Africa and the potential that there is in Africa for solar, that they have got a great potential if peace and stability can be achieved. Next slide, please. One thing in the UK I'd like to point out is that people are saying that we've got to go to heat pumps. And that is perfectly true. Heat pumps have a very high coefficient of performance. They're more efficient than a gas boiler. But, and this is really important, heat pumps cannot get up to the same temperature as an ordinary gas-fired boiler. A gas-fired boiler operates at about 70 to 80 degrees C. Now, the heat emission from a radiator is 1.3 power law emissions, but the heat pump can only get up to about 45 or 50 degrees C. Now, if somebody comes along and says, I can put in a heat pump for you, it's more efficient than a boiler, that is true. But you've got to double or treble the number of radiators you have. You've also got to insulate the building because you won't get the heat out of a heat pump. And this is the danger, that you can get cowboys coming along and saying, we will install this, you'll get a government grant, it's more efficient, but in actual fact, it doesn't give out so much heat unless you do something to the insulation of the building and you actually put in bigger radiators. And the best thing, especially for churches and chapels, is if you go for a new floor and you can have underfloor heating. Heat pumps love underfloor heating because the temperature there doesn't get more or less above 40 degrees C. So that is ideal, a radiant heating. And that's just one of the things that we've got to be aware of, a major problem I see coming. When I gave a talk in Transition Wilmslow, which we have where our style chapel is Norcliffe, I was thinking, what does the Old and New Testament say about energy conservation and climate change? And I came across Gordon Kaufman. He was a theologian in Harvard. He died in 2011, but he said that God is the mystery of creation. And the universe and its development, the evolutionary process, and human development with its religious beliefs all come from that. And being a scientist, that really struck a chord with me. So the mystery of creation is either a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Hindu, or even an atheist. They are all mankind's trials to find out what life is all about. And we've got this book, the Unitarian minister, who's actually written this book, is Cherishing the Earth, Nourishing the Spirit. And as Kaufman said, this mystery of creation leads to a more radical Christianity. And if we look at morality, and this is my own triangle here, but it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you start off with the animal instinct, self-preservation, then you go up just as Maslow's hierarchy of needs go. And I think that the top level of morality is helping those we will never meet and those we will never know. And this means future generations and people on the other side of the world. Anyway, that's my lot. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Really great kind of grounding on why we're here today. And it's great to start those links to faith as well, and that connection. Thank you very much, Jeff. And now I'd like to invite one of your colleagues, Chris, to the floor. I think Frida's going to share Chris's slides as well. So Chris Walsh is a researcher at the Tyndall Centre in Manchester as well. And Chris previously worked with the Church of England's Cathedral and Church Buildings team on climate resistance, and with the Salford Catholic Diocese on developing climate action connected to faith buildings. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Matt said, I'm going to just talk about a kind of few of the lessons we learned through that work that I did, both at the Church of England on kind of resilience, and that was on a lot of things that churches can do to make themselves, to protect their heat envelope or to protect themselves from flooding or other kind of extreme weather events, all the way through to my work with Chris Jones as well, that we did with Salford Diocese, where we were looking across faith groups at successful retrofits and successful interventions in this kind of space, and trying to work out what was the same in each of those, like what the lessons we could learn from those are from a kind of more social sense as well as from a very practical sense. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start with a very quick plug. If you are interested in what I'm saying, and if some of it resonates with you, and you'd like to kind of take next steps, but that you're not sure where that might be, just recommend, I've added a link to this on that first page of my presentation, but with Salford Diocese, we released this environmental stewardship in places of worship report that's kind of a very practical guide to what you can do and what kind of actions you can take, and which churches might be in the right, and which faith buildings might be in the right kind of places to make those. So I'll come back to that at the end, but if we go to the next slide, I'll just kind of talk through three kind of areas, I think, which are really important to consider in terms of how you approach retrofit as a community group, and particularly as a group within a faith group as well. First one is to consider the leadership of a group like this. In the most successful groups that we saw, it was usually led by one or two people who didn't then have another big role within the church or within their voluntary work. The reality of engaging with this, and particularly engaging with the funding system, which I'll touch on a little bit later, although I can't offer people grants, I'm afraid. The big thing this takes is time and energy invested in doing it the right way, learning how to make funding bids, how how to structure your work you're doing, working with contractors. So that leadership is really important, and it's really, to be honest, it's very important that that doesn't come from a clergy member or equivalent whose profession involves the church the whole time. That can make it really, really difficult. The second thing I'd say is it's really, really important to engage within diverse age groups, particularly in this kind of work. You'll find certainly a lot of churches that I worked with when I was working with the Church of England, that the most successful groups engaged with people who were teenagers all the way up to people who were retired. And that massively increased their ability to do one of the things I'm going to talk about when we do talk about funding. Third thing I want to just mention is about overwork, and this kind of fits in with that suggestion not to rely on the same people again and again to do this, who are already doing church maintenance or who are already doing welcome team or whatever that might be, in that you risk pushing this into the ability of only very few to do it. So you really need to make sure that you share this kind of burden, because it can be a real burden. And then the last one I say is about maintaining focus. The reality of a lot of the projects that we were with is they took place over a scale of 5 to 10 years. They weren't easy wins. The funding system takes time. Learning to make funding bids that get funded takes time. Engaging with the retrofit and the audit process takes time. So I just say being able to maintain that focus is really, really key. If I can go to the next slide. So the second thing I want to talk about is about bringing the community along with you. In terms of work that I did, I worked with one project I shouldn't name, but it was very driven by one person within the church who had great ideas, but they didn't engage with the rest of the community, and actually that project ended up failing because that person, because of life circumstances, ended up having to take a step back. The church didn't really understand the direction. There wasn't that support built up already within what they were doing. So the first thing you have to do is communicate, both in terms of things like Jeff was speaking about the theological reasons for doing it, as well as the scientific reasons for doing it. The second thing I'd say that's really important is understanding needs within the church. This is particularly important when we talk about the kind of retrofit projects you want to engage with. Understanding about thermal comfort, whether it's more appropriate to suggest people might wear more clothing, or whether there is actually a real need to make changes in terms of the building itself. And the final one is about engaging with your clergy/faith leader and getting their support for your project. There is very little evidence that any projects that don't have the support of someone working at the church is going to happen. And I just wanted to bring up the Colchai Reform Synagogue quote from them that we had about all the ways that they communicated throughout the process. They did a solar installation on top of their roof, and throughout that time, constant communication through the magazines, the website, all through social media, but particularly for them, it was about WhatsApps, and that was the way they communicated as a faith group as well, and a community. And so lots and lots of WhatsApp, letting people know what's coming on, letting people know that there are meetings, letting people know there are decisions being made, so that they never reached a point where people felt left behind by it. Can I get to the next one, please? So I said I'd talk about financial support, and obviously this is a massive issue for a lot of groups, and one of the hardest things to do, particularly when you consider the amount of time these funding applications can take, and without a guarantee of success. So in terms of boosting your ability to be successful in funding bids, partially it depends where you're bidding. So obviously, if you're bidding towards the National Lottery or towards the Church of England's own internal funding pots, please go through your diocesan advisors if you're in Church of England, or the equivalent in other groups, who have both the knowledge of how to do those funding documents, as well as they've almost certainly looked through, rated, or awarded funding themselves. So understanding how their mind works and the things that they're looking for is really, really important. Secondly, in terms of if you're going for grants around from local government sources, of which there are some, or other sources like quite often you'll find refuse sites offer grants around climate in the local area. So it is really worth looking. Consider the wider use of your church, and the amount of people I talked to who had tried for funding for a long time, and then when they started talking about what the church actually gave to the community outside of the services or the heritage, which are important, don't get me wrong, that was when they had that real breakthrough, when they were talking about the events that the church held regularly, when they were talking about the scout groups that used their building, when they were talking about their food banks. That was when more secular organizations were able to then support them more easily. And the last point, again, I just emphasize that certainly in the Church of England, but across, there is training routinely offered around funding bids specifically. And that training that I've seen is absolutely great and absolutely worth your time, particularly if you are going to be doing this, not regularly, hopefully, but for a considerable amount of time. If I could go to the next slide. So talking again about our this is from the document that we put together about stewardship. These are kind of the 4 broad areas we split our document into about the things you might want to think about within your church. And again, a plug, if you don't understand these things, or if you think you do and you just don't know where to go, I'd really recommend just going through this and having a real think about what your priorities as a community and a building are, and being really, really kind of deliberate in that process. If we go to the next slide, just to finish off, this is what it looks like when you kind of follow that system through. So what we've done is we've tried to give these kind of flow charts that give a really explicit detail on each thing that you may need to do in your garden or may need to explore, that can hopefully act as a starting point either for discussion or for those discussions with local area leaders or with professionals who are employed within the groups. So thanks very much. I welcome any kind of questions when we get to that portion as well, and I will do my best to answer those.
Thanks very much, Chris. Really great presentation. I really also was interested in your bit about the kind of co-benefits and how we talk about these places as a community asset, whether it's the scout group or food banks and things like that, which are all important when we're trying to build a best case or a business case for getting retrofit funding. So if you do have a question for Chris, do please pop it in the chat. So after our next speaker, we'll have a mini Q&A where we'll put those to the speakers. But our third speaker is Chris Martin, and I think Frida's going to share the slides. Great. So Chris Martin is Secretary at Footsteps and part of the Quaker Climate Emergency Action. And Chris has also coordinated some really inspiring work connecting faith and climate action across Birmingham over the last decade and more. So really pleased to hand over to you, Chris.
Yes, so thanks very much, Matt, for organising the webinar. I'm going to be talking about the energy audits that we've done over the past 3 years, which really sort of complement Chris Walsh's contribution, because in a way he was looking at successful sustainability projects. Energy audits are really just a specific tool that have a place to play in those processes. So Footsteps has done 28 Fabric First energy audits over the 3 years. The first ones were funded by Project 4F, and at that stage we also gave small grants for small improvements. But all 28 have been done using the same process, and they were all done by Phil Beardmore through Eco Birmingham, who will be speaking specifically about his approach later on. We carried out a review of the 28 audits at the end of last year, where we contacted the places of worship and tried to find out what progress had been made. Many we knew about because we've been in constant touch with them. So next slide, please. So because we were working across Birmingham and across all Birmingham's faiths, we were working almost entirely with what might be called in the trade difficult to retrofit buildings. And although they're faith buildings, you can see one had been a cinema, that's Sri Ram Mandir. One had been a council library and swimming pool, and probably about only 2/3 had actually been built as faith buildings in the first instance and weren't currently occupied necessarily by the same faith. Harriet will be later on talking about the work we did at Cottridge Quaker Meeting House, which by comparison is an example of what one might call an easy to retrofit building. I mean, not that it's going to be simple, but it didn't have all of the challenges that the 6 buildings that you can see in front of you have. So next. So our evaluation did actually identify that the Fabric First approach is a valid framework. It worked on 28 buildings, and we had the benefit of having done all of the audits in the same way. And when we did the review, the action taken based on the audits was mixed. Some used the audits to inform major sustainability improvements, and Almadi, that Phil will be speaking about, made massive reductions in its energy use through measures identified in the audit. Quite a proportion of the audits were used to inform longer term plans. I think that's one of the things we learnt over the 3 years. It was better to not to push the audits too hard as something which then has to be all done immediately. But the concept of having a building passport where you're identifying the various sustainability steps that need to be taken at various stages. And the most important is if your heating system is getting towards the end of its life, work out how you're going to replace it before it actually fails. I mean, we had quite a number of places of worship coming to us in desperation because heating systems had failed in the middle of winter. So using the audit to inform a building passport or faith building passport, I think is one of the main outcomes and conclusions from it. We found that significant numbers of places of worship were deterred by the high cost of changes. And a few in particular of the earlier audits where we were not making a charge, the audit was just accepted as a report, and there was no energy to take forward the actions which were identified. Next slide, please. So I think this is sort of echoing really what Chris Walsh said, that the key stages that we were encountering were that the initial impetus must come from committed individuals or a small group. The next stage is sort of identifying and planning improvements, and this is where the particular type of audit that we were doing fits in. It's part of gathering information on what are the options, what are the changes which are needed, and gathering information about options in ways which relate to your particular building. I sometimes am asked about sustainability improvements, and I find it difficult to answer in general, because you need to be looking at the issues involved with a particular building. Thirdly, we've been touching on, the funding. The audit often needed to be complemented, in particular, by specialist boiler and heat pump advice, sort of going the next technical stage. And the fourth factor is that the implementation and the project management of a major sustainability improvement or faith building is a whole area of expertise in itself. So I'll welcome questions in a moment.
Thank you very much, Chris. Really great to see just how many different audits of different faith buildings there are, and also the diversity on showing all those photos of the different places of worship in Birmingham is really great too. Thank you, Chris. So we're just going to take a few minutes now to have a short Q&A with the first three speakers, if anybody has a question. So that's Professor Jeff Livermore and Chris Walsh from the Tyndall Centre, and also Chris Martin from Footsteps. I see one or two questions in the chat, but do please put a question in if you have one. I'm not sure, Chris, either Chris or Jeff, the extent to which you can answer this, but if I ask it, maybe other people might know as well. Rebecca Reese asked about retrofitting a church hall which is connected to the church. She's particularly looking at replacing the windows and wonders whether there are any grants for church halls connected to churches. There's been a couple of responses in the chat. Someone mentioned about Veolia, the waste management company, who might have a small grant, and the community infrastructure levy at local authorities. But any of our speakers, if they had any ideas, or if anyone else has a thought on that, do let me know. Quite specific, I realise.
I'm not 100% on this, but I think the church halls connected to churches count under churches, but I think that is definitely worth a question to either your diocese or equivalent.
I think the important thing is that what frustrates me is that people look at windows and think, oh, we need double glazing. But as both Chris's have said, it's important to do an energy audit because putting some insulation in a roof can often be better than just replacing windows. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned is controls and monitoring a building. Actually knowing what its kilowatt hours per metre squared are for gas and electricity is very important, and looking at yardsticks, for which there are in the Church of England and also in the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, what optimum and what poor is. But controls can be monitored sometimes by an energy management system, or you can buy what they call a little eye button. That little eye button will monitor temperatures over periods of an hour, 2 hours, and they can be in there for 3 months before they're downloaded. And you can actually see what's performing. And it's very useful to see what the temperatures actually are. And if you're overheating the place, if you're not switching on at the right time, or it's overheating, switching on too early. We found that what the plumbers had said was happening wasn't happening, and we had a frost stat. Now, most church and chapel insurances will say that you must have something to stop it freezing overnight, and they will suggest you have a frost stat. Now, that frost stat's often set at 5 degrees C, which is fairly high, and ours was put in a little porch which had no heating in it. So it's bringing the heating on for both the church and our council room needlessly, because there was nothing in this porch to freeze. And we just moved that frost stat into an area that was the coldest area in the council room that was actually heated. So it was more representative. And I think that's quite important. I'm afraid I don't know about grants for windows, but it's priorities. And it's sometimes not always windows that are priority.
Thanks, Jeff. Chris Martin, two questions for you. One is asking, what does fabric first mean? And another from Nadia, how can they do an audit? Is the energy audit mentioned available for the public to use?
Well, and Phil Beardmore is on the webinar, and he will be explaining all about the fabric first approach in his presentation. And the energy audits which we did were very much built around Phil Beardmore's expertise in the area. And I think maybe it's an issue for this webinar is, you know, how can others access the sort of audit that that Phil is able to do. I think it's a known fact that there are not a great number of people around who can do a skilled energy audit of a building, you know, multifaceted, looking at all the issues. But I think it's best probably to come back to that question after Phil's presentation and put it to him.
Great, thanks, Chris. So there's been lots more questions in the chat, and we'll move on to the next presentation. But just to say, if any of the speakers do see any of the questions in the chat they'd like to answer, you can do so there. I'd just like to mention one comment from, and it's disappeared now, but it was, Ellie Nathan said that where grants are restricted for religious buildings, you could consider partnering with a community energy group who may be able to support in crowdfunding capital needed for retrofit buildings. So that's just another way of thinking about things. So our final two speakers will look at actual case studies of energy audits and getting retrofits done. And the first one of which is Harriet Martin. So thanks, Frida. So Harriet became a Quaker over 50 years ago, and throughout this been working both as a Near Eastern archaeologist and as a primary school teacher. But in the last 20 years, most of her energy has gone into understanding and combating climate change, and she's here to talk about the retrofit of the Quaker Cotteridge House. Over to you, Harriet. You might be on mute. I can't see you.
Yes, unmuted now. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Yes. So our meeting house, which you can see on your screen now, was built in 1964 by a rather young architect with an experimental bend. So some things not quite as you'd expect. It was built as all electric. And this was a time, 64, when I think most people assumed nuclear generation would be providing cheap electricity on into the future, and electricity was the way to go. It is the way to go again now, but for rather different reasons. So December 2004, about 10 of us attended a talk on the imperative of acting on climate change. I'd been aware of it for a good 25 years at that point, but didn't know what to do about it. Following the talk, we formed a small group with a core of about, well, in the end of about 3, to see how we could improve our meeting house. So there we go. And started with a survey of it, as you'd expect. I keep fiddling here because my computer's insisting on not showing me what we're doing, and it's getting on my nerves. I won't touch my keyboard anymore. I'll be able to concentrate a bit better. Yes. So yeah, the building itself, it wasn't the formal surveys we've been talking about, but it was what, you know, it was not that big a building. It just had to think what we were doing. And yes, windows. In this case, the building has over 50 windows. You can't see them from the front. You will be seeing them in the final slide from the back. To our surprise, our walls for the 1960s are solid. They're 3 bricks thick, so they're as thick as if they have a cavity, but they don't have a cavity. They have 3 bricks. So that was new and interesting. Our roofs, however, were quite thin, probably only about 4 centimeters of insulation. And the meeting room, I mean, lighting is something we haven't talked about much, but what a real surprise when we looked at the meeting room, it had 18 150-watt incandescent spotlights. So, you know, you get out your calculator, do a bit of maths, and you realize quite easily, if those are on, say, 4 hours a day, much of the year, that's 6,000 kilowatt hours just there, which is quite a lot more than our whole house uses. So then, that's another thing. How is the building heated? And we were heated at that point with 12 storage heaters. Numbers in different rooms, etc., but all storage heaters. And they used a tremendous amount of electricity, which came at night, was relatively cheap. Regardless, by the evenings, however much they used, however hard you tried, by the evenings the room was cold in the winter. So they weren't really doing their job for all they were using a lot of electricity. Yes, can I have the next slide, please? Yes, we did a lot. This is really probably in the wrong order. This is showing some of the things we did. When it came to insulation, we insulated the walls from the inside as we didn't have cavities. And you can see here, we discovered, we went to the NEC, which in those days had trade fairs for all sorts of things, including retrofitting. And talking to people, we discovered how you did it. And there you see Chris doing it. He's putting up the wooden laths. And then you see in the next slide next to it, our son, who at that point was helping us put the panels onto the wooden laths. So it was, yeah, the expertise we acquired by going to trade shows and talking to people, and then following instructions. Relatively easy in our case. Right, next slide, please. The other thing we did, the very first thing we did, was change our electricity supplier, because we were using British Gas, and we discovered that you could get companies who were working very hard to give you 100% renewable electricity. So we tried actually to go with Ecotricity, and we're told by them in 2004 or 5 that they didn't have the capacity to give us what we needed. They were being very honest, we're not generating enough. So we went with Good Energy instead. We next changed the lighting in the meeting room. That did seem a rather easy hit, and it was. Well, it took us several goes to get the right sort of light bulbs in, but you can see the difference between 2004 and 2005 in this bar graph. That is a change of lighting in the meeting room. So all we did was change the light bulbs, and it reduced our energy use that amount. You then see quite a big step between 2005 and 2006. Well, the storage heaters did us a favor in 2005. There were 4 in the main meeting room, 2 of them failed. So we had to change the heating. You know, we either had to get more storage heaters or something else. We looked along very hard, assessing things, and we decided the way to go for our room was an air-to-air air source heat pump. This is an air conditioner running backwards. You know, the sort of cassette you'll see often in a shop in the ceiling, and you think that's the air conditioner. It can equally well be a heater. And yes, we did that in 2006, and we double glazed that meeting room as well, which also had some quite big windows. So the reduction in energy use there between 2005 and 2006 was the mainly the heat pump with some double glazing in the meeting room. And 2007, we did some of that DIY installation on the 2 main the 2 outside walls of the meeting room, which were fairly easy to do. And that reduced energy use by, again, an appreciable amount. So monitoring, you know, just reading the meters the whole time became very, very satisfying, as you could see it going down, reacting to everything we'd done. The following year, We insulated the walls in the foyer and the classrooms. We replaced another 5 storage heaters with 3 air source heat pumps and did some more double glazing, working room by room. 2009, by this time things were coming on really well. We were down to under 20,000 kilowatt hours a year. So the walls, finished the wall insulation and the double glazing, and one air source heat pump replaced the last 3 storage heaters. And we put on a so-called warm roof. And this was something that's already been mentioned, is you can get grants from, well, this place, Veolia, who had a recycling center about half a mile from the meeting house. And we tried twice to get this sort of grant, just a word of people doing grants. And we were told, after we rejected the first time, it was partly because we asked for the whole amount. So we reckon it would cost about 25,000 to re-roof the whole meeting house with insulation above the existing roof, and then a membrane above that. That's a warm roof. And we were told to be about 25,000. So we tried to get the whole amount from one grant. We didn't get it. Talked to someone and they said, well, the thing to do is to ask for a proportion, a decent proportion, but not the whole thing. So we asked Viola for 15,000 of the 25 and we got it, which was pleasing, made all the difference. And the roof was beginning to leak as well, to be perfectly honest. So it was good in several respects. 2016, we went back to the lighting. We put in LED lighting in the classroom, the corridors, the kitchen, which was making a difference, not quite as much noticeably, but it was still there. 2017, at the end, we then retrofitted as well the warden's bungalow that was now a car park, because the wardens at that point had left and we were getting new ones. We had some time in between. So we put external insulation on that building. We put it already had a warm roof. We reduced some of the window sizes and so on, but we then covered that roof. Oh, yes, I missed something out before. We covered that roof with solar panels, but in 2010, we had covered the meeting house roof with solar panels. Yes, it was 2010 we did it. So we now had, well, by the time we did all the insulation work, the roofs, the roof, the windows, the walls, we had reduced our heating use by about 80%. Also within that, moving from storage heaters to heat pumps. All that together reduced about 80%. Then from the generation of the solar, first on the meeting house roof and then on the bungalow roof, that knocked off another probably 17%, various calculations. So you're down to about 97% saving from where we started, which is great. And can I have the last slide, please? So that's showing the meeting house from a recent Google shot, and you can see rather better the number of windows. Person said it was a wonderful place, glass walls, looking into the garden from the meeting room, the big bit at the top right, the foyer next to it, and the long classroom wing. All of them had these originally sliding plate glass panels, which opened up, so you were into the garden. And now it's all double glazed with smaller opening sessions. But you can see the panels on the main roof done in 2010 and on the bungalow done in 2017. But they are the icing on the cake. I like it. They look like icing on the cake. They are the icing on the cake. It's not what you go for first. It's a nice bit at the end. First of all, you just cut back on your usage. one final point, the advantage of the air-to-air, these air conditioners running backwards, is that they're blowing warm air into individual rooms. They each have a control unit that can be pre-programmed or turned on and off as need be, overriding it. So they are, I mean, they're set to temperature, set to time, gives you much, much more control over over usage. So I hope I haven't run over time, and I suspect that's pretty much covered it. Oh,
Great.
yes.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say
That was
that
the last photo.
the very last slide was just saying, doing all this, getting involved with the Eco Church meant actions moved well beyond the fabric of the building. And so we were working on encouraging people to eat vegetarian, vegan, cycle, all this sort of stuff as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Harriet. That slide showing all the steps you did in each year and the impact of that was brilliant. And also really appreciated the quick win of switching your supplier in the first instance. So trying to get to a renewable tariff is a great thing people can look at doing, tomorrow and getting going. So thank you very much for that. Now it's time for our final speaker, who is Phil Beardmore. So Phil offers strategic environmental consultancy that includes energy saving advice to householders and small businesses, and is also a specialist in organizational and cultural change to support decarbonisation. And he's got a varied experience in supporting a range of buildings, including faith buildings as well. So your slides are just coming up. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Matt. Let me put it on slideshow. Okay, so I worked on the Footsteps program, which you've heard quite a bit about. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk about one of the buildings that I helped, which is the Al Mahdi Institute in Birmingham. So the Al Mahdi Institute is an Islamic center of Islamic scholarship, both a physical location and online. And they're located in this building in a conservation area in Birmingham. And so this is not like a traditional place of worship as far as the building is concerned. There is a chapel that you can see there on the left. This was once upon a time a Christian building, but now that chapel building is used as a mosque. But the majority of the site is a college, a residential college, and so it's in terms of my approach to this building, it's more like a small hotel than a conventional place of worship, such as a church or a mosque. Now, the methodology that I use when supporting a site, such a business or a non-profit organisation or a place of worship, is this workbook that I've developed over a number of years, which I use to gather information to develop an energy saving strategy for the business. This version is available for you to use. So if you're thinking of doing this in your own place of worship, then you might find this useful. Afterwards, I will share a link in the chat as to where you could download it from. And this is an illustrated version that I've been able to develop with financial support from Solihull Council. It's important to say I don't describe this as an energy audit. An audit is something that once a year a charity pays an accountant to do, and they produce a report and nobody takes any notice of it. And so I tend to call it an energy saving strategy or a decarbonisation strategy. Usually when I'm supporting an organisation such as a place of worship, then what they're interested in is the emissions from their building itself. In other words, what we call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from the use of gas and electricity mainly in a building. And so if depending on who's paying and what their goal is, if they're mainly interested in scope 1 and 2 emissions, then the approach is the energy saving hierarchy, which is shown in this picture, which shows us the order in which we should do things. And various people, Jeff, I heard just when I arrived, was talking about, and Harriet also talked about, often you start by doing the simple things first. Sometimes I'll be advising somebody that is interested in all of their greenhouse gas emissions, including scope 3 emissions, such scope 3 emissions from things like transport, food, and so on and so forth. It's interesting that the Church of England does not yet require churches to report on scope 3 emissions or to reduce them. But I suspect that will come in the future. However, there are places of worship that have significant scope 3 emissions. So last year, for example, I advised a synagogue in the Midlands. This wasn't in Birmingham, it wasn't part of Footsteps, but this synagogue, essentially they run a Meals on Wheels service, and so their scope 3 emissions were much greater than the emissions from the building. So it is worth considering scope 3 emissions, reporting on them and having a strategy to reduce them. In the case of the Al Mahdi Institute, they were mainly interested in, at this point, in their emissions from the building. They were less interested in scope 3 emissions, although I suspect their scope 3 emissions are significant. Now, the workbook that I will share the link to shortly does enable you to adopt the kind of fabric first approach that Chris and others have talked about. And on the Footsteps program, sometimes you do take a fabric first approach. A lot of places of worship are actually more than one building, and so you'll get two or three buildings on the same site, and the buildings will be different building archetypes. Some of them you take a fabric first approach, and so often you will find a church-shaped building and a community hall-shaped building and maybe a vicarage, a rectory, a manse. And sometimes in the community building or the manse, it's possible to take a fabric first approach. Sometimes in a church, it's more difficult to take a fabric first approach. In the case of Al Mahdi Institute, because they're in a conservation area, then that limited fabric improvements. But the other factor was the fact that the building, the site is huge. And that they didn't have much money. And so the strategy that I came up with for that building was not fabric first. It was, in fact, if anything, it was heating controls first. And so in terms of the top recommendations, in terms of carbon saving effectiveness and financial return on investment, then modifying the heating control regime and upgrading the heating controls, plus other bread and butter energy efficiency measures such as LED lighting, improved lighting controls, upgraded hot water cylinders, were more cost effective. This doesn't mean that we ignored fabric measures. We did consider fabric measures, but the return on investment in terms of both carbon saving and financial saving for those measures was far longer than for these measures, and so those were the measures that we prioritized. So Al Mahdi is not typical of places of worship in that sense. However, as Jeff has pointed out, in many cases, heating control. My view on heating controls is that almost every building can make better use of existing heating controls. Out of every single person, household or business that I've advised over the years, it was only last year that I found a building that I did not advise to change the use of their heating controls. Every single one, I advise them to change the use of their heating controls, and it's usually in the top 6 measures. Shout out to Dorridge Methodist Church in Solihull, whose use of their heating controls is so perfect that I advise them not to do anything to them. But that is the first and only time that has ever happened to me. You'll also notice number 9 is monitoring strategy. This is the thing that people forget. to have a strategy to monitor it, so you can demonstrate that what you've done is worthwhile, and prove to funders that it's worthwhile. The other thing that I did with Almadi, and where I do, if the client wants it and if the funding allows, if there's a budget for it, is to use data to monitor progress and set carbon targets. So in the case of Almadi, what I looked at was, first of all, what is their baseline energy use? Again, this is something that Jeff referred to just before I came on, and Harriet, Cottridge Quake. One of the reasons why I do this is because of the example of Harriet and Cottridge Quakers, who are exemplars in terms of monitoring, their energy use. And so it must have been 10 years ago that I first went to Cottridge Quakers, saw the monitoring that they'd done, and realised how important it was. I've done the same on my own house for 20 years, but this is how I went about it with Almadi Institute. So this was their baseline of gas consumption, electricity consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I think it was Jeff talked about the benchmarks. So the Chartered Institute for Building Services Engineers publishes benchmarks of gas, electricity, and carbon emissions for various building types. In the case of Almadi, so most places of worship, I will use the benchmark that CIBSE have produced for a church. In the case of Almadi, because it's a mixture of offices, colleges, and small hotels, then I use benchmarks for those buildings, and I set them a target based upon the measures that I'd recommended. So one of the outcomes of this is that Almadi Institute were able. I don't know if my slides have gone. I think I've. Right, can you still see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So Almadi Institute, we identified a potential funder. Unfortunately, that funding stream no longer exists, so don't ask. But we identified a funder, and Almadi Institute agreed that they should go for numbers 1 and 3 in my recommendations. In other words, upgrade the heating controls. And they got quotes for an upgraded heating control system with smart controls. I think it was about £10,000. And the funder required them to demonstrate to predict the savings in greenhouse gas emissions, energy, and fuel bills. And so I helped them with that. They put that information into the funding application. The funding application was successful, and they were able to implement the heating controls upgrade. And when we went to Footsteps organised an event at Almadi a couple of years ago now, and we went on a little tour, and Roxana, the building manager, she showed us around, and she went through how effective that had been. One of the other things that I mentioned in the recommendations was was about insulation of hot water pipe work. Now, inside most buildings, there is usually hot water pipe work that has missing or incomplete insulation. In the case of Almadi Institute, they had hot water pipe work on the outside. So the hot water pipe work came out of the boiler room, around the outside of the building, and then back into the building to heat it up. And unfortunately, what you can see here is thermal images that I took of that pipe work, and you can see the red and the white. So white is the hottest, red is the next hottest, and you can see areas of red and white representing significant heat loss. So it was like having radiators on the outside of the building. Now, the blue areas of pipework, so you can see the pipework comes out of the building and round a corner. So the areas of blue are where there is insulation. The areas of red and white, two things had happened. First of all, the pipes were so close together that the insulation was compressed, which undermined its effectiveness. And secondly, the white areas are actually where crows had pecked the insulation. And so I recommended that they replace it and box it in. Because although I like crows, I think they deserve a better diet than pipework insulation. So in terms of future programs, and I think programs are really important, because I see a number of people ask, I get approached by individual places of worship all the time across the country. And by the way, this wasn't unique, because the very next day I advised a synagogue in London, and they had exactly the same problem. And I think they must have had the same architect as the Ahmadi Institute, or some M&E engineer who thought it was a good idea to put hot water pipe work on the outside of a building, because, as Harriet said, years ago, people used to think that we'd get free nuclear power forever and we wouldn't need to worry about these things. So I get approached by places of worship across the country, and sometimes I can help them, sometimes I can't. The good thing about Footsteps is that it is a program, and therefore it is widely known in Birmingham that there is this program that can help you, and it's had funding from a number of sources, thanks to the works of Chris in persuading funders to fund it. But one of the good things about a program, as opposed to individual sort of help, which I'm always prepared to give if I can, is that it enables you to prioritize. And I think, as Chris has said, a number of people that we helped through Footsteps did file the report away. And I think that faith organisations are at high risk of doing that. And I think we need to prioritize. And I think my view is that anybody that has got money to spend on supporting places of worship should prioritize support to those who show the greatest commitment to change. And so I think there needs to be a process that is robust but proportionate, because sometimes you'll see, I mean, I've worked on programs where I've been asked to go and support organizations and there is no application process. And there was one place of worship that I turned up to. It wasn't in Birmingham, it wasn't Footsteps, and they had no idea why I was there. They thought I was there to do a health and safety inspection. That's how low their commitment to the cause was. On the other hand, you have the groundwork program, which is currently closed. That's an excellent program in many ways, but their application process is the opposite extreme. It's off-putting because of the level of data you have to put in the application. I also, Matt mentioned in his very flattering introduction to me that I help organisations to address the cultural and organisational barriers to change, which are quite significant in faith organisations, because people become attached to buildings and particular ways of working. And I think that where I've worked most successfully with faith organisations, it's where we're able to address that. And I think that future programmes should really think about building in that kind of support. Also, I mean, I think Footsteps Footsteps on the most recent work that I've done for Footsteps, it also includes hand-holding. People need follow-up to support to implement a decarbonisation strategy, and people that receive hand-holding are more likely to implement change than people that don't. And that hand-holding doesn't have to be intensive. It's basically me being on the end of the phone to say, yes, I think, so typically we've got 3 quotes for such and such a measure. We don't know which one to choose, and I help them to interpret that, and that can make all the difference. I also think that where people are receiving support through a funded program, I think it's reasonable to ask them to report upon what they've achieved 12 months down the line, and to monitor with help with the impact of what they've done in carbon and energy saving terms. And for most places of worship, that should not be onerous. So thank you for listening. I think we're going to move to questions. I'm going to do a little tiny plug. So bottom right corner, you can see Birmingham Green Doors, which is a programme that showcases energy efficient buildings in Birmingham, mostly houses. We did have one at a place of worship. But if you go to the Birmingham Green Doors website, birminghamgreendoors.co.uk, our next event is a live study visit and follow-up webinar to see energy saving measures at my own house. There are several people on the call that have been involved in Green Doors in the past, but now it's my turn. And this is quite a story in terms of what can go right and what can go wrong. So you're very welcome to that. And if you're not in Birmingham, then there is a webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Really great presentation. And just to say, Phil's slides will be and the recording will be available to anyone later on in the week. We'll make sure we send this on to everyone. So we are out of time, but before, if anyone would like to sit down and ask any questions of any of our final two speakers, do that. But before then, I just wanted to quickly say a massive thank you to all our speakers, and just in case anyone does have to go. So Professor Jeff Livermore, Chris Walsh, Chris Martin, Harriet Martin, and Phil Beardmore. So thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time to pull together those presentations and bringing varied perspectives. So finally, if anyone had any questions for Harriet or Phil, do please let me know. Phil, there was one question from Marcella asking about whether you were able to share the name of the synagogue that was looking at retrofit, or if not, you could get in touch with Marcella maybe. But
the one in London, sorry, because I'm in London.
No, the one, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it had. I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was in Newham.
Okay, maybe I can contact Newham Council then.
Yeah,
It's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. And Phil, a question from Patrick, who says, what training is needed to get someone assessing retrofit needed for faith buildings to your level?
I think the most important qualification. I mean, I think that, yeah, the most important qualification, I think, is the AECB carbon light qualification. I think that is the gold standard of understanding decarbonisation of buildings. I'll just put that in the chat.
Thank you.
And I'm just posting a link. I'm just posting a link to the workbook that I mentioned. Sorry, autocorrect has kicked in, and I need to change that. So it's AECB Carbon Light, and I've just posted a link to the workbook. I've just uploaded that page 10 minutes ago, so apologies if it doesn't work straight away. Come back later.
No worries. Thank you, Phil. We do have a final poll, so I've just reposted it again. If anyone would like to share any feedback, but also talk about what actions they might take as a result of coming to this webinar, but also what types of topics or areas they'd like to see covered at future sessions between Ashden, Footsteps and the Bahu Trust. But does anybody have any final questions? Phil, Nadia also asks, would you say the workbook is the final step for places of worship?
First step. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
the reason why I produced this workbook and to make it, you know, freely available with pictures, thanks to my graphic designer, Amy Purdy, little plug for her, is because I wanted other people to use it if they found it useful. There are other tools that other people have produced. So if you know of anything else, then I wouldn't say don't use it, but mine is there if people find it useful. And yeah, I mean, there is stuff that you there is stuff for almost every type of building in there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Phil and Harriet, and all our speakers and everyone for joining today. So we will share these slides and the recording later this week, and we'll be in touch when there's further information about our future webinars, everyone that signs up anyway. But thank you very much for joining, and we hope it's been useful, and have a nice evening.